Hello, I'm Bo Weidema. This is the 6th video in a series of 10 on consequential modeling in lifecycle inventory analysis. We have now come to the 6th video, which is on comparability, how to define the functional unit. What do the standards say about this issue? Unfortunately, very little. The functional unit is defined in the standard as a quantified performance of a product system for use as a reference unit. And then it says that comparisons between systems shall be made on the basis of the same functions quantified by the same functional units, and that the scope of the study shall be defined in such a way that the systems can be compared. That is about all. This means that we have to turn to other sources that have dealt with the issue of comparability. One of these is marketing science, and another is competition law. For LCI, some additional literature has been provided in form of a short procedural guideline produced for the Nordic Council of Ministers as part of the work with the PEF, the European Product Environmental Footprints. This work has been based on the work that I performed back in the beginning of this century for the EDIP project and a Danish consensus project funded by the Danish Environmental Agency. So the legal definitions that are relevant in this context are those of the European Commission in 1997 on competition law, where the relevant product market is defined as all those products and services which are regarded as interchangeable or substitutable by the consumer by reasons of the product characteristics, their prices, or their intended use. Likewise, a geographical market is defined as the area in which the conditions of competition are sufficiently homogeneous. The market is the place where the customers express their requirements via purchases. This in turn allows us to identify what are the obligatory product properties on these markets. And from that, we define the functional unit. Therefore, our procedure has 3 steps, where the first one is the market segmentation. 3 types of segmentation is possible: geographical, temporal, and customer segmentation. Geographical segmentation is based on the differences in natural geography, in regulation of competition law, for example, market entry, so how you allow people to enter the market, legislative product requirements. These are typical in relation to public procurement, product standards, packaging regulations, or more economic regulations like quotas, taxes, and subsidies that differ from geography to geography. Consumer culture can also play a role. To justify or document that there is a geographical separate market, lack of imports is an obvious choice. However, there may be situations where a regulative barrier has recently been removed, but the market still has not reacted to that, so that we still see no lack of imports. We still see lack of imports. Another situation is when you have a chain where market A supplies market B that then supplies market C, and you would not identify any imports from market A to market C, which in the end, of course, still means that we have only one market for A, B, and C. Temporal market segmentation is mainly relevant for service products like electricity and telecommunication, where we have peak markets and baseload markets. Very separate situations. And also for perishable products, we might see seasonable differences like we see for vegetables and fruits. Another example of a temporal market would be the seasonal market of tourism. And we also have situation for recycled materials where the immature or unstable conditions of these markets may lead to the situation that we sometimes see a limitation of the market by supply and sometimes a limitation due to the demand. And this gives different temporal situations on the market. And finally, we have customer segmentation. Customer segmentation. There we have the customer segments defined as being large enough to support a separate product line, but also clearly distinct and non-overlapping, so that substitution between segments can be neglected, and all products within each segment are substitutable. The same product may serve different needs, that is, having different functional units, thus being sold on more than one market, belonging to more than one product category. Also, very different products may serve the same need, that is, have the same functional unit, thus being in competition on the same market. We have market segments that can be divided into market niches. Niches are where niche customers only consider niche products substitutable, but where the majority of customers allow substitution between the niche products and other products in the segment. For example, we can define the segment for food and a segment for footwear, where there is very little overlap. Within the food market, we can identify niche markets for meals versus snacks. And within meals, we can talk about restaurant meals and home-cooked meals. And within restaurant meals, we can identify another niche of, for example, seafood restaurants. So the data sources we need for market segmentation is primarily coming from marketing departments of the enterprises that supply the products to the market. Secondary sources can be retailers that also have sometimes a coverage of more than one segment, industrial associations, industrial research institutions, and industrial consultants, marketing and consumer research institutions. In situations where supply substitution is possible, then no segmentation is needed. Supply substitution is when suppliers are able to switch production between various qualities of the products in the short term without incurring significant additional costs or risks, even when the different qualities are not regarded as substitutable by a given group of customers. The different qualities should then anyway be grouped into one product market and category. An example of this is meat producers that may easily shift between different cuts of meat in response to changes in supply and demand. These different cuts can then be regarded as belonging to the same market and product category, even though the customers may not regard the different cuts as substitutable. The same reasoning may be applied to avoid unnecessary geographical market segmentation. For example, the situation where a product like a pharmaceutical product is labeled so that it can be sold in many different geographical areas, and therefore a change in the demand and supply on one of these markets may not really influence the ability of the company to market on another market. And therefore these different markets can be regarded as one. Let's use food as an example. All foods are ultimately substitutable. This justifies that food can be regarded as a generic product category, which can then be further specified according to different market conditions. Consumption takes the form of either meals or snack. Each of these two niches can then be regarded as separate, and the market for meals can then be further subdivided according to temporal meal types like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, which is justified by the fact that meal suppliers typically change their menus depending on the time of day. Substitution does occur between temporal market types and between meals and snacks, which justifies that all still belong to the same product category. Beside this temporal division, the markets for meals can be subdivided further depending on the location and type of meal supplier. And this subdivision is supported by cross-elasticity studies like the one here mentioned from the United States Department of Agriculture, where the difference between food away from home and home-prepared foods are documented. The three markets for meals that can be identified is home-cooked meals, restaurant meals, and institutional meals. These are very different in terms of who actually supplies the meals, but also in terms of the options that you have for diet planning, which is not really possible in a restaurant where the customers change from day to day. But in an institutional kitchen, this will be a core issue of meal planning, that you actually look at the diet of the people who will receive this meal over the time. Also, the availability of a real choice of the consumer is limited in the case of an institution, and to some extent also the home-cooked meal is not, you cannot choose between different households. And the last three or four issues mentioned are about the freedom that the different markets give for the customers to influence the further segmentation, like the meal type, the courses, the composition of the courses, the portion size, and the ingredients. In the end, the household's choice or the consumer's choice is largest when you have the choice between different suppliers and different restaurants. In the home, you have some influence, but the person who is actually preparing the meals will typically decide quite a lot of things. And in the situation with the institutions, there is very limited influence on what is actually served. So within the meals, there is no need to further market segment the home-cooked meals and the institutional meals, because there is simply no influence enough for the customers. On the restaurants, where there is a large influence of the customer, then it makes it reasonable to identify further market segments or customer segments. And the information for this we can find in different internet search portals like TripAdvisor, where you can search for restaurants according to their price level, according to what cuisine, like region, nationality, or typical ingredients like seafood, or dishes like pizza or steakhouse, preparation methods like barbecue and sushi, or presentation method, for example, buffet versus table service. It will be very hard to find or allow a restaurant to serve things which are not within their cuisine. For example, to find a sushi restaurant that can then suddenly supply a pizza to the customer that desires that. The step 2 is then to identify the obligatory product properties. Out of all those properties that a product may have, all the obligatory product properties, and only those, shall be included in the functional unit. So obligatory product properties are those that the product must have in order to be at all considered as a relevant alternative. And these are typically related to functionality, technical quality, additional service rendered during use, recycling and disposal, or the costs related also to either purchase, use, recycling or disposal. All of these can be described in quantitative terms, typically as intervals with a minimum or a maximum value. That allows that we can define everything in quantitative terms, covering at least the functionality, the expected level of quality, and the duration or lifetime of the product. Typically popularized in terms of what, how well, and how long. The same product category, or rather the same product property, may be obligatory in one market and not obligatory in another market. The data sources that we can use to identify obligatory properties again come mainly from the marketing departments of the enterprises supplying products to the market segment, retailers, industrial organizations, and in this case also regulating authorities and standardization bodies and marketing and consumer research institutions. The kind of information that we're looking for is, first of all, things that are really regulatory defined, either in regulations or in standards. Then we can look at evidence from market events or shocks in the recent past where there has been a lack of supply that then motivates the consumers to change to another product. And we can see, okay, they're willing to change. In another situation when they're not willing to change, this is reflected in the supply constraints leading to people simply waiting until the product becomes available later. We can also find market surveys that supplies this kind of information, especially if they also ask for what competing products the customers may have considered or what properties are regarded as obligatory for purchase. More advanced surveys may use choice experiments where consumers are asked for their preference for goods with different levels of different properties, often with price as one of the properties. There is a number of quantitative techniques that have specifically been designed for the purpose of identifying substitutability. One of these is cross-price elasticities, where you express the demand for a product in percentage change per percentage change in the price of another product. We can also look at time series of price movements, where the different products either show similarity of convergence in their movements over time. These two issues are mainly about identifying covariance, but if you really want to prove that there is a substitutability, you might need to further document that in terms of causal relationships and using more advanced techniques in the price series analysis. Normally, this will only be required if the existence or lack of substitutability is subject of a controversy. It's also not necessary to have access to the resulting numerical information of willingness to pay or cross elasticities or diversion rates. what you really need is just the information that a specific property or a specific product has a positive cross elasticity. That is, that there is a change in the price of one product or property that leads to a change in the sales of another product with a different property. From this, it can be concluded that the two products and properties are regarded as substitutable, as from the perspective of the consumer. Back to our food example, we can look at how long the portion size is an obvious how much issue. But we can also talk about how long in terms of how long you will feel satiated by a meal. How much time will pass before you need an additional meal. And satiety can be determined by subjective scores, or more scientifically by compensation scores, where you serve one meal and then another meal later and see how much the energy intake in the later meal is depending on the energy in the preload meal. And if you want to go the full way, then you go and measure serum levels of ghrelin, also known as the hunger hormone, which is closely inversely correlated to satiety. How long could also be related to the time that you use for preparation or consumption, especially in the fast food market niche. This might be a relevant obligatory product property. But this actually may be related back to the market delimitation of fast food as a market niche, where this is an obligatory product property. So this example shows that the identification of obligatory product properties actually make you go back and look at your market delimitation and say, well, we should actually have delimited this as a separate market. So we have an iteration step between the market delimitation and the definition of obligatory product properties. If we look at the how well aspect of the functional unit or obligatory product properties, the most obvious quality issue is, of course, absence of contamination or absence of adulteration. That is, that none of the food components have been intentionally substituted or diluted for the purpose of reducing production costs or increasing the apparent value of the product, so that you're misleading the consumer. This is typically regulated by law and enforced by sample testing and inspections of good manufacturing practice by national regulatory agencies. Also, the Codex Alimentarius requirements can be seen as obligatory. The Codex is a collection of international standards on foods, covering both the general practice guidelines for manufacturing and measurements and labeling, and standards for many specific foods like canned salmon, preserved tomatoes, and so on. There is, of course, a lot of different properties that may be obligatory for different kinds of food. Some of these can have to do with the diet requirement, so you look over a longer period of time, not just for one meal. You look at the price range or the budget range you have, the maximum time allowed for preparation and consumption, health concerns, and here this may be even more important to look at that in the context of diets, and variation in terms of the minimum time since a meal has been served last. This is obviously not applicable to restaurants that have different customers all the time. Some properties may be obligatory for specific dishes or components, like shelf life, serving temperature, ranges of flavors, flavor strength, texture properties, and there are several measurement methods for these depending on the type of food you're looking at. Niche markets may furthermore specify even more obligatory requirements for example, cultural and ethnic food preferences or special dietary needs or special occasions. An example of the use of cross-elasticities, if we look at the positive cross-price elasticity, we can find the example with beef and pork. These meats are identified as substitutes because they have a positive cross-price elasticity and therefore a common market. That means that they should actually be placed in the same product category. That, of course, doesn't mean that there might not exist customers in a niche market that would still only look separately at beef or pork and regard those as non-comparable. This might actually be more and more the case as people get more and more aware of the large environmental difference between those two products. A negative cross-price elasticity example we have with coffee with respect to milk. Here we see the negative cross-price elasticity, which means that the milk is a complement to coffee. Even though coffee and milk obviously belong to different non-substitutable product groups, milk should be included as a complementary product in an LCI of coffee and coffee substitutes. We've now come to the last step, the step 3 in the procedure, to quantify the functional unit. What we do here is simply put a quantity on the things that we have already identified, namely the obligatory product properties that are required in the identified market segment. This functional unit should as far as possible be related to the functions of the product rather than to the physical product. So for example, rather seating support for minimum 7 years than one office chair. In that way, we are ensuring that all the obligatory product properties, both how well as the duration of the product performance, the how long, are addressed together with the how much. We can take an example again of a food in terms of an institutional meal, and this could be expressed because the institution has a large influence on how they define their functional unit as a dinner meal with a satiety-weighted energy content of 1500 kilojoule. Further specifying that the protein quality should be no less than 80% of the DIAAS adult reference value, no less than 3% of the energy in the form of linoleic acid, with a purchase price ranging from between 4 and 6 euros for the sum of meal ingredients. So these are the kind of things that an institution would care about. There is further requirements that each meal should include 2 fresh vegetable ingredients and a total minimum weight of 225 grams, of which maximum 50% can be juice. Further, of course, all measurements, ingredients, and preparation procedures should fulfill the Codex Alimentarius requirements and all further requirements specified for the product categories of each specific meal component and ingredient. So this is a very extensive functional unit, but you can see it captures all the things that are obligatory for the institution. For a household, it would probably look a lot simpler than this. A question that you can ask is, does the size of the functional unit really matter? And in most LCAs that support small decisions, you can assume that the consequences are linearly related to the size of the decision. So the size of the function doesn't really matter. But for ease of comparison, it may be an advantage to set the size equal to something that the readers of your LCI report can immediately relate to. So for example, the annual per person consumption of the studied product in the studied market segment. For LCAs that support specific decisions with large nonlinear consequences, the functional unit should have the same size as the expected outcome of the decision, exactly because the nonlinearity means that the results will depend on the size of the functional unit. So to summarize the procedure, comparability is only possible when the functional unit reflects the substitutability of the product in its market, where the product has a functional specification that the customer requires to be fulfilled, what we call the obligatory product properties. Therefore, the procedure has 3 steps. First, you identify the market segment for the product. Then you identify the obligatory product properties in this market. And finally, you express the functional unit as a quantity of these obligatory product properties. Finally, we just have to talk about the reference flows. For a comparison, you will need to express the functional unit in terms of some physical amounts of products that are comparable and substitutable on the market. And therefore, they can be different. Even though the functional unit is the same, the reference flows for each product system can be different. For a composite product, the reference flow will typically be identical to the parts list, or what you also know as the bill of materials, multiplied by a factor to scale it to the functional unit. Not only the obligatory product properties must be considered, but also the positioning or market irrelevant properties if they lead to additional activities in one or more of the analyzed product systems. That could, for example, be if you are buying a beverage that you would not really care about how the bottle will be cleaned later for recycling, but that influences when you should compare that bottle with a one-way bottle, and therefore the washing of the bottle, which is a non-positioning or even you could call it a market irrelevant property because the consumer simply doesn't care about it. Therefore, you need to include that in the reference flow anyway. That could also be changes in consumer behavior if people simply use the product in a different way, even though it fulfills the same function for the user. Rebound effects is another example where people are paying a different amount of money for the product, or it uses a different amount of time and space. Differences in the need for maintenance, replacements, waste treatment, and for recycling. So, one thing you have to think about as well when you talk about reference flows is that they have to be valid in the long term. And here we encounter a problem with the term efficiency. That often efficiency is regarded as something important, and the more efficient the product is, the better. However, if you are too short-sighted in focusing on resource efficiency, you may overlook that even though you have a short-term efficiency improvement, that can make the product more fragile or vulnerable to variation in environmental conditions or disruptions in resource supply. So to ensure a long-term validity of a comparison, the reference flow must include such risks. By including the consequences of foreseeable disruptions or by having a kind of plan B, that you see that you prevent this from happening by building and maintaining the necessary resilience to limit the consequences of disruptions or simply avoid them altogether. For example, by having sufficient stocks or alternative supply options to counter such disruptions. With this little addendum on long-term validity, all that remains for me to say is now it's time to digest.